One of my favorite things to do at the start of the year is to plan out all of the books that I'm going to read. The past month, I've been adding books like crazy to my wish list, and today I'm going to share my top recommended reads for 2022 with you. Now, if you've been on my channel before, you know that I'm typically talking about the book publishing industry or giving you writing tips for strengthening your story. But I wanted to do a different kind of video this week and give you a little bit of insight into my personal reading list, because truly one of the best ways that you can strengthen your writing as an author and how I can strengthen my skills as an editor is to read what is being published. I think it is super important to keep a pulse on books that are coming out, as well as just exercise that love for reading, that passion for reading that likely brought you to writing, that brought me into editing. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit today about what I'm excited to read this year. A few disclaimers before we dive into my reading list. First, I was truly not sponsored in any way to name any of these books. They really are 100% books I've come across that I do plan on reading. Secondly, these books are all contemporary and were published in the past few years. That's just because personally, I really like to stay on top of the books that are coming out so that I can really advise my clients on where the publishing landscape is going, what the book market is looking like. So that's why I just typically read books that have been published in the past few years. That is absolutely not to say that books that were published 5, 10, 50, 100 years ago are not worth reading. Some of my favorite books were published a long time ago. This is just what I'm planning to read in the new year right now. Lastly, these are all books that were traditionally published versus indie or self-published. That's really just speaking to the places I'm seeing books online. I'm reviewing bestseller lists. I follow a lot of agents and editors on Twitter, and so I see books populate on social media that way. Absolutely not to say that I'm not interested in reading indie or self-published books or that they're not valid to read at all. This is just, again, what has come up for me and what I'm interested in reading at the start of this new year. If you're interested in reading, writing, editing, book publishing, any or all of the above, I recommend subscribing to my channel. I am a professional book editor, and every week I talk about publishing, writing, reading, and everything in between. So I would love to have you around. All right, so let's get into my recommended reads for 2022. For each one, I'm going to give you the genre as well as the year that it was published and just a little overview of what I know about it thus far. Again, I haven't read any of these books yet, so forgive me if I get something wrong and you have read it already, as well as why I chose it for my list. So let's dive in. The first book on my recommended reads is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is a memoir that was published in 2021. And I feel like it just blew up my social media whenever it came out, and I'm still seeing it on a ton of bestseller roundups. I'm seeing it on best books of 2021 lists, and I've just been really excited to read it. The author is a lead musician in the band Japanese Breakfast, but this is about not only her music, but also about her connection to food and her Korean culture. She also lost her mother to terminal cancer, so it's about dealing with her grief and reckoning with that experience as well. I've been seeing it all over outlets from the New York Times to BuzzFeed to Instagram. So it seems like this memoir is really resonating with people, which excites me a lot because I actually minored in creative nonfiction in college and was always really passionate about memoir. And so I love to read memoir whenever a great one comes out. I'm also really excited to see how the author discusses these themes of loss and grief within her very unique and particular experience. The second book on my list is We Are Not Like Them by Christine Pride and Joe Piazza. This is a work of literary fiction also published in 2021. The premise is that this follows two best friends, one who's Black and one who's white, who are reckoning with an incident where one of the friends' husbands is involved or present during the shooting of an unarmed Black teenager in their community. It has been compared to An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, which is a book I absolutely loved, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend picking it up because it absolutely blew me away, and it is one of the few books that I really recommend to everyone to read. So whenever I saw that this book was being compared to that, I immediately put it on my wish list. I'm also really intrigued that there are two authors here who seem to kind of parallel the two characters in the story. So I'm interested to see how they blend their writing styles and if their individual approaches come through to create a cohesive narrative. I'm sure it does, but it's always interesting to see how two authors create one cohesive whole narrative. The third book on my list is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This is a literary fiction / fantasy novel published in 2020. The premise is that there is this magical library out there that we follow the protagonist into, and each of the books contains an alternate version of her life, such as that she made one different decision and it branched out into this whole alternate universe, alternate reality. And she's given the opportunity to potentially pick living through a different alternate reality. And the question is, if you were presented with that option, would you live a different life? Because we're always thinking back on, what if I had done that differently? Thinking back to maybe decisions that we regret and how that might have changed how our lives play out. And this really gives that hypothetical a tactical, tangible reality in this fantastical library. This one has been all over the bestseller lists as well as popping up everywhere on TikTok. So I absolutely had to add it to my to-be read list. It's also called, in a lot of the reviews, a feel-good read, which I really appreciate, especially because I work on a lot of suspense and thriller novels. That's my specialty, so I'm kind of always in a dark place when I'm reading for work purposes. So I'm really excited to read this one and have just a totally different kind of narrative. And something uplifting is always really inspirational to read. The next book on my list is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This is a horror novel, and it was published in 2021. So kind of going from one end of the spectrum with The Midnight Library to the other, I just mentioned I read a lot of dark fiction, and I guess this is much more in line with what I'm typically reading. The premise here is about what happens to the survivors of really brutal massacres, what's often referred to, especially in slasher films, as final girls, after they go through that traumatic experience. And it follows a group of these final girls who form a support group and are really there for each other as they potentially face a new threat, of course. It was the Goodreads horror pick of 2021. So I really don't typically read horror books. I do read a lot of suspense and thrillers, which maybe have a little bit of gore in them, but not specifically horror. And I definitely don't love horror movies, but I was really drawn to this one for some reason. I think because the intriguing premise, it really seems different from others in the genre. It also reminds me of the book Final Girls by Riley Sager, which is more of a thriller, and I really, really loved that book. So the theme of Final Girls just kind of intrigued me, and I saw this as the Goodreads horror pick for 2021, so I thought I would add it to my list. The last book on my to-be-read list for 2022 is Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukovka. This is a thriller / suspense novel that was actually just published in January 2022. The premise follows a serial killer who is on death row, really getting ready to have his last breath, but it follows the women who are kind of orbiting around his life, both a detective as well as potentially women who are close to him. So this novel kind of reverses the traditional serial killer narrative where in a thriller type novel, we are getting inside the killer's head, we're trying to understand him. In this novel, from what I understand, we're really seeing the ramifications of what he's done on these other women that are surrounding him or whose lives have intersected with his in some way. So I really like that kind of role reversal. I was really excited to see this book coming out because I loved the author's first book, which is called Girl in Snow. I thought it was absolutely stunning. She manages to balance really evocative literary writing and amazing character development with a really propulsive plot. So when I saw the premise of this one, I had to immediately add it to my list. So those are my first 5 selected reads of 2022. Let me know in the comments what's on your to-be-read list for this year, and also if you've read any of the books that I've mentioned or if maybe they're on your list as well. I love to add to my book wish list, so please give me all of your recommendations and favorite reads. As always, if you like this video, please hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel. I'm so excited to continue growing this reading, writing, and editing community. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.